because the Rebbe had been a man in extremely good health and vigor, and he was not known to have to be worried about what doctors had to say. He definitely took care of his health properly. But as does happen when you're in your late 70s, the Rebbe was 77 at that time, 75 at that time. He did develop a blocked artery in a major part of his heart. And it was clear to those in attendance at the Farbrengen, those doctors who were there came to see the Rebbe. They took a cardiogram. They verified that he had had a blocked artery in a major part of the heart. And with that, the Rebbe was informed properly. He was alert and clear in thinking, and even told his wife how he thought. He felt strongly that he should be able to get his care in the presence of his Hasidim at 770. Unfortunately, 770 wasn't equipped to be a hospital, and all the doctors there unanimously agreed that the place for the Rebbe would be a coronary care unit with the proper surveying or monitoring of cardiac rhythm, which was a very important aspect of cardiac care, as well as all the various medicines and the administration, usually intravenously, of these medicines, that all these things would be necessarily done at a hospital. And they sternly advised the Rebbe to agree to go to a neighboring hospital. But the Rebbe stood his ground. He said he had reasons to think that he would get the best care being among his Hasidim. And he told Rebbetzin Mushka Schneerson that he really felt this way, and she fully understood and was on board with him on this matter. Unfortunately, the heart attack continued on, and none of the doctors wanted to participate to try to get this started. There just wasn't any equipment. They felt inadequate for the job. And they said, maybe we can find someone in New York who will do this. But with calls that Rabbi Krinsky made and all this, there was no such doctor that came forward. And they were sort of stuck with the problem of the Rebbe insisting in a full state of mind that he would get his care at 770 to be among his Hasidim and with his wife and his family. And things were not going well, though, in terms of the actual cardiac events. He lost his blood pressure. With that, he was unable to really converse anymore as the night went on. And by the early morning, I got a call about 7 o'clock here in Skokie, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. And we have a Shabbos phone that I answered. And I was shocked to hear this from Rabbi Krinsky. I had never really met with Rabbi Krinsky. I knew him because he was the brother-in-law of my dear teacher, Rabbi Herschel Schusterman, as Rabbi Hertz mentioned. But I really hadn't ever had any engagement with Rabbi Krinsky to be able to have a conversation. But I told Rabbi Krinsky when he asked me, would it be legitimate for us just to take the Rebbe over to a hospital now that he's lost his ability to converse? And I told Rabbi Krinsky that I recognize the problem, but I don't think the Rebbe would in any way be satisfied with doing something like that without his consent. Even though it was a life-death matter, I said, we got to find some way of caring for him at 770. And the only problem is I had just 2 years earlier moved from Boston to start my medical practice here in Chicago at Northwestern University. I had no colleagues in New York who I could think of right away. And I told Rabbi Krinsky, I think it would be more ethical if we made arrangements for the Rebbe's care at 770 rather than moving him to a hospital, since he gave such explicit direction to all the people who talked with him about this. And I left the phone and I said, this is not adequate. And I suddenly had a flash of recall of one of my favorite teachers in Boston at the Harvard Medical Center, where I was trained. I said that Dr. Louis Tischholz, who was such an outstanding Jewish doctor who took care of everyone with such a full heart. And he was now the chairman of the Department of Cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. I said, maybe I can call him. And I went ahead and made a single call to the switchboard at Mount Sinai Hospital. If you've ever had the occasion to call a doctor's office, let alone a hospital, you know this is not a very efficient way of reaching a doctor. But I talked to such a wonderful operator. The switchboard operator was so kind that she said, I can hear the urgency in your voice, Dr. Weiss. I'm going to walk away from my switchboard, which at those times was just wires plugged into patches. It was a very old-fashioned kind of switchboard at Mount Sinai. She walked down a long corridor to reach Dr. Tischholz and practically pulled him by his ear to her office, where she put him on the phone with me. And this is something that I've never seen replicated in all my years of practice, where you call a hospital and get immediate service like that. And certainly these days, it's even worse than when it was then. But I reached Dr. Tischholz. He remembered me very fondly, and he told me that he doesn't know much about Lubavitch. He has never met the Rebbe. I mean, he knows that there is a Lubavitch Rebbe, but he was one of the pioneers of echocardiogram, was going to be giving a national tour, a lecture tour, that he was going to forfeit by taking on this responsibility. And he really didn't know much about Lubavitch, but he generously volunteered to come in, because I explained to him that I'm willing to come in myself, but it's going to take 3 or 4 hours to get over from Skokie to the airport to New York to Lubavitch. And I said, I'm going to make my way in while you're doing this. And I really commend you, Dr. Tischholz, for being so kind. He was not only so kind, he was so competent. Little did I know that he was making the trip for sure, but I told Rabbi Krinsky, I believe that he's the man who's going to be the hero here. And I want to make sure that we all have the story straight, that I was not the doctor who saved the Rebbe's life. It was Dr. Louis Tischholz, with the kindness of his heart and his generosity of spirit, who took the responsibility to come in all of a sudden, drop a national tour he was supposed to make on an important subject in cardiology to save the Rebbe's life. And he was the one who was effectively the agent of refuah in a very direct way. Meanwhile, I had to wait till the bank opened, because I didn't have a credit card then. And I had to wait till the bank opened at 9 o'clock so I can get money for the plane trip. And then had to schlep our old jalopy car, our only car that we had, to schlep out. My wife had 2 little children at home, little babies, and had no one in Chicago she knew. She had just, almost against her will, moved from Boston, where we lived, to Skokie, where it was not her home environment. So she had no helpers. She had no car. I moved out to the airport and got on the plane. And while I was davening on the plane with complete heart, I came upon the Akedah, story of the Akedah, which is early in the prayers we do at Shachris. And in the story, it talked about Yitzchak asking his father, I see the preparations for a sacrifice you're going to give, but where is the sacrifice? And Avraham assured him that there would be brought a sacrifice. He didn't mention it was going to be a son, but I remembered that, and I said, really, we almost need this kind of miracle that, we're doing all these things. How are we going to really solve this problem? And I got off the plane, running to the cab stand to get to Brooklyn, and was told by the director of the cab stand that no cabs are being allowed by the police to go into Brooklyn because it's so tense. There was a murder in the past week or two in the Crown Heights neighborhood, and they can't let the cabbies drive into that part of town. So I said, what do I do as an alternative? Well, he said, you could take a bus over to the Jackson Heights station and take a number 7 train to downtown New York and then catch a Brooklyn-bound train. And I said, well, how long was that going to take? He said, probably, at least an hour and a half or 2. I said, oh my gosh, we're going to lose this whole battle to something this peculiar. So I go back into the airport, looking for someone who's getting off a plane and asking if they're possibly driving or have a car that's going to drive to Brooklyn. And there's signs all over the airport at that point warning against such activity. The police are going to arrest anyone who tries to negotiate a ride with the cab service closed to Brooklyn. And I took my risks, and I asked someone getting off the plane who looked like they might be New York or Brooklyn bound. And suddenly a policeman taps me on the shoulder. He said, are you Dr. Weiss? I thought for sure he was coming to arrest me. But Rabbi Krinsky ingeniously talked to the chaplain of the New York Police Department, a Jewish man, a good Jewish man who just recently passed away, I might add. I'd read that in the New York Times, that the 2 of them agreed that anyone wearing a hat on that hot autumn day would not be Jewish. But an Orthodox Jew would not be in the airport on Yom Tov either, because it was Shmini Atzeres. So they spotted me with my hat on. This is a Marshall Field hat from Chicago, which is a lighter color, so the Rebbe could see me quickly in the Farbrengen with all the darker hats. If you compare my hat color with Rebbe Hertz's hat color, you'll see there's a shade of gray difference here. But they spotted me immediately through this smart ingenuity of Rabbi Krinsky and the chaplain of the New York Police Department, and I was immediately rushed on Interborough Parkway to Crown Heights. When I got there, it looked like the Red Sea was packed with a bunch of Hasidim, all very solemnly crying over the Rebbe's situation because they had heard about us having a heart attack. And they had to part the Red Sea to make a way for the police to bring me through. But the problem was I looked kind of young. Now I look old because I am old. But then I was a 33-year-old who looked a little younger than my age. And everyone was shocked that this is going to be the person who rescues the Rebbe. He looks like he's just gotten out of medical school, maybe. So I could see gross despair on the part of the crowd because I just wasn't old enough for the job. And they brought me to the front door where Rebbe Schneerson was standing. And she was, with a big smile, she told me, "Dr. Weiss, thank you for coming. We had never met before. Thank you for coming. Your friend, Dr. Tischholz, came and knew exactly what to do. He put things together. And my husband's blood pressure came back miraculously. He's now fully conversational and in good spirits. And I see that you brought the right person in." So this was such a relief. She first took me to have a little small kiddush for Yom Tov before I was even allowed to see the Rebbe. It was such a relief that miraculously I got a police escort when everything was down in the airport for transportation, that the crowd, as unaccepting as they were of my youth, suddenly saw when they saw Rebbe Schneerson's face and talking with me, the mood suddenly elevated because they all saw something was going well. And it was a joy to meet the Rebbe, even in the setting of illness. He was so perceptive and so kind and so understanding and so willing to listen to two different cardiologists, one a senior cardiologist and one a very junior cardiologist. And talking with the Rebbe brought out the depth of his ability to grasp a situation and really understand it, even in the setting of such illness, was amazing. And we were very successful in seeing him come back. I also was able to recruit a number of other colleagues, including my teacher of cardiology was Bernard Laun, a Nobel laureate. I arranged for him to come in from China to join us on the team. And a childhood friend, Larry Resnick, Dr. Larry Resnick, was at that time the military chief officer at the naval base in Hawaii. And I had him brought in to help me. And we had a couple other doctors, Dr. Robert Feldman, the doctor who took care of a lot of people who lived in the Crown Heights neighborhood, a very devoted general practitioner who was able to help us in a great way as a general doctor. So we had a very good force of doctors who literally, by taking shifts, worked day and night to see that the Rebbe was put together in a very, very meaningful way medically. More importantly, were the technologies that Dr. Tischholz brought in. He brought in monitoring that was not heard of by anyone in those days, because Dr. Tischholz had been a chief consultant for the NASA program, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration program, where they had developed telemonitoring instead of wired monitoring for patients, which radically changed how patients were cared for. They were previously strapped in bed on these heavy wires, not able easily even to go to the washroom or stand up or daven or whatever they wanted to do. Now we had little pads with mini transmitters that were transmitting electronically through the air all the Rebbe's cardiac signals and all that without a bunch of wiring. The Rebbe could get up to daven. The Rebbe could go to the washroom in a convenient way, in a private way. And it was radically different from what hospital patients were getting. Even the best hospitals, like Mount Sinai, and even the best hospitals like Cornell in New York were not providing this kind of care for their heart patients. In addition, we had such support from Rebbe Schneerson, who came in at 4 o'clock every afternoon to have tea with the Rebbe. So he was having real contact with his wife in a meaningful way for a little tea party every afternoon, even in his coronary care unit. And he was amongst his favorite possessions in his study, which were his books. So he kept up his reading on all kinds of matters. The Rebbe's reading was very broad. It was not limited to what we might have in our libraries. It was a general thing about science. The Rebbe was trained as a mathematician. He was at one time trained under Nobel laureates in Germany who were particle physicists who became lifelong friends of his. I mean, things the Rebbe knew were beyond my imagination. I even asked him about a friend of mine who was at the core of central research for the DuPont company in Wilmington, Delaware, and he was developing multiple sclerosis. And I asked the Rebbe, does he know much about multiple sclerosis? And the Rebbe had just gotten through reading a British Medical Journal report linking multiple sclerosis to immune reactions to certain viruses. Everything was more than fantasy. It was like the Rebbe knowing so many different subjects, being able to go in his library and his study, which was not a big study, to just pull up articles about the different things that had medical or applications in physics. And this was the Rebbe that I was getting to meet, who was so perceptive and so broad-minded. It was just something extraordinary. And in the course of our taking care of him, we set up our little CCU, and I went back to Chicago after about a week and a half or two of intensive care, and then coming back on frequent weekend visits to make sure things were going well. And on a regular basis, I would call Rebbe Schneerson in the evening, and she took me in almost like a son. She was always checking the weather forecast in Chicago because she wanted to make sure it was safe for me to take my bicycle to work, as I was prone to do. And so she also knew the scores of the Chicago Cubs, my favorite team. And so that was very important to her as well, following the Chicago Cubs scores to make sure I was in a good frame of mind. More than just the triviality of taking care of a sports team, she also took care of me as someone who she understood was going through a lot of transition, I had to give up my medical practice right away because the people with whom I worked were not Jewish and did not understand why I had to suddenly leave for New York to take care of the Rebbe. So there were a lot of transitions in professional work that were definitely disruptive to my own personal career, but very important for what was necessary here at Lubavitch. Over the years and going to Farbrengen many times a year, I had a chance to really kind of learn the cycle of what went on in Lubavitch. And I got to know many of the people behind the scenes who really were at the core of how Lubavitch runs. And whether it was Label Bistritsky, whether it was my favorite fish merchant, whether it was someone who was really concerned about my connections in Chicago and how taking good care of family members in Chicago. But everyone I met was just totally helpful, open-handed, and kind. And it was a wonderful experience to be a member of the medical team here, because the people in the Lubavitch were so receptive and appreciative. And really, not all the time as a doctor you get that kind of appreciation. Rabbi Hertz expressed this very well in his talk before mine, just of how appreciative the community was. But it really helped a lot in being able to deliver care. There was also the problem of we had a lot of doctors, which means we also had a lot of medical opinions. And how was this to be resolved? Dr. Laun, who was quite a bit more senior, thought one way sometimes, and Dr. Tischholz had a way of looking at things, and I would have another way of looking at things. Dr. Resnick would think about things, and Dr. Feldman had to do practical things that were realistic and to work into a schedule. But the Rebbe listened attentively to each one of us. The Rebbe was a person who could sit with 5 people and 5 opinions and harmonize them and make everyone in the group felt as if they had been listened to just as much as anyone else in the group. And that really is hard to pull off because doctors are very opinionated. They have strong wills. Sometimes they have egos. Unfortunately, we're all human beings. But the Rebbe was able to take the 5 doctors and harmonize their thoughts and opinions to make a meaningful combination of ideas that worked. And really, we had such success. The Rebbe was a very good follower of instructions. He understood the instructions about diet and whatever, sodium, so as not to be in congestive heart failure with extra fluid. And he and the Rebbitzin were just ideal, an ideal family to take care of because they really followed the advice verbatim. And Rebbe Chesed Halberstam, who at that time was the steward of their household, was very attentive to following advice on the matters of the preparation of food properly. And this made all the difference in the world. Really, not only did the Rebbe have the freedom to walk around the study and without all these wires and straps, but also had the ability to be treated like a human being. And this was so in contrast to even the best of hospitals where you couldn't get care like that. So things went quite a bit more smoothly than I had ever predicted. And we came then to Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and Larry Resnick, who at that time was manning the fort for me. I was in Chicago. He and I talked on the phone and we agreed that it was time to let the Rebbe return back home from his little mini CCU, coronary care unit, where he was being confined. And it was a day of great celebration all throughout New York. Seeing the Rebbe get out of his hospital, little mini hospital, was such a joy to all the community, and became, as we know, a Yom Tov that we celebrate every year with great gratitude to Hashem for the miracle of seeing the Rebbe be his life rescued, his care being given in a very humane and proper way, and coming back to his most important thing in life, which was his wife. And as he explained to me, he said the biggest victory in Rosh Chodesh Kislev was not necessarily surviving all this. It was really being reunited with his wife to have their daily tea party in privacy with the ability to talk with each other. They both were so bright. They were almost like intellectual sparring partners of one another. So it was a great stimulus to the Rebbe and the Rebbitzin to have these conversations in privacy of their home and in the comfort of their home. And this was the biggest victory that the Rebbe, he said to him, being with his wife for tea at 4 o'clock was on par to him as the importance of putting on tefillin in the morning. He wasn't rendering a halachic decision here. He was saying what it meant to him as a person and what it did for his neshama, what it did for the Rebbitzin. And it really was a wonderful victory. And we continue to be very, very much in contact. I made trips for about 7 Farbrengens a year for the 15 years that I was actively taking care of the Rebbe. And many wonderful stories came up. I'll just tell a couple of them, not to bore you, just to tell you, to amplify the story a little bit. For example, when I finished my first 2 weeks of being in Lubavitch, I told the Rebbe that, I'm going to go home now to my family and try to recoup my dissolved medical practice and whatever. And he was very concerned. He said, if before you leave, Dr. Weiss, I would like to ask a favor, if you could just take a brief listen to my wife's heart. The Rebbitzin never goes to the doctor to have these things checked. Could you take a listen with your stethoscope? And I said, of course. Is she having any symptoms? He said, not that I know. And I asked the Rebbitzin how she felt, and she wasn't having cardiac symptoms. But when I listened to her heart for a few minutes, I heard a little murmur over one of the valves. And this is not a serious thing. Many of us in this audience probably have heart murmurs or not in any serious condition. But I just took note of it, and I told the Rebbe to just remember that I had heard this little sound if it ever comes. And lo and behold, in 1981, which was 4 years after the Rebbe had a heart attack, I was telling the Rebbe about my public high school and my Cheder studies with Rabbi Schuster in Chicago. He was very interested in everything. He wanted to know what the high school was like. I said it was mostly Jewish kids who were all friends with each other, a friendly high school, public high school. And I said, I'm going to the reunion, the 20th reunion of my high school in 1981. And the Rebbe was very excited. He said, were you friends with a lot of the kids in the class? And he said, I was very good friends with about half the class, and the other half I didn't know so well. but it was a wonderful experience to go to a high school with nice fellow students. And even though it was not at all religious, it had no Jewish orientation that way, the fact that the people were Jewish interested the Rebbe, because to him, if you're a Jew, that's what's important. So he wanted to be sure that I went to the reunion. Lo and behold, as we went into the weekend before the reunion, I get a call from Binyamin Klein, one of the Rebbe's secretariat, that the Rebbitzin all of a sudden has developed a bad fever. She's unable to concentrate on reading the newspaper, which she read, and the magazines that she read, and the books that she read. She just doesn't seem to have the ability the stamina and the ability to read these things. And it looks like she's really getting very, very sick. And then I remembered the heart murmur that I had heard 4 years earlier at the Rebbe's unexpected request. And then I asked Binyamin Klein to send me a little photograph of her fingernails, under which I saw little marks, which were characteristic of a disease called endocarditis, which is heart valve infection. It's a fatal disease. If it's not treated, it's invariably fatal, because the body is showered with bacterial infections on the heart valve that keep breaking off and going to various arterial sites, whether in the brain and the eyes, all over. And I told Binyamin Klein to pass on to the Rebbe that even though it's on the eve of Shabbos, I'm going to come in to see the Rebbetzin right now on hearing this. And the Rebbe pleaded with me to go to the reunion instead and come in after the reunion. But I decided, even though I'm one who would respect the Rebbe, whatever he says, I've got to make my own decision on this. I don't want to delay by 2 days to come in and see the Rebbetzin when it's too late to start doing good, and these things have broken off the valve and cause all kinds of problems all over the body. So I get on a plane, it's already Shabbos, and I get into Crown Heights, it's 10 o'clock p.m., and I go up to President Street, the street where the Rebbe lives, and knock on the door, figuring no one's going to hear me. They're all upstairs sleeping or resting or studying, and it's Shabbos. And right as soon as my second knock, Chesed Halberstam, the steward of the house, opens the door immediately, and I see the Rebbe sitting in his beautiful kapota on his chair in the parlor, and he's expecting me to come through the door right then and there. So he knew me well enough to know that I would not listen to him. And it was a very, very warm meeting, and I went upstairs to listen to the Rebbetzin and confirmed my worry that she had this disease called endocarditis. And I conferred with my teacher, Bernard Laun, and Dr. Tischholz, and a few other doctors I called across the country just to make sure everyone was on board with the idea of subjecting her to 6 weeks of intensive antibiotic therapy that poor Dr. Robert Feldman had to give 4 times a day, even though he was busy with his practice. And the Rebbe's in a very small vein. She was hard to put the IV in each time. But he, without complaining, suffered through 6 weeks of this. But it did cure her of it, and she was fully restored. And when it was all over, the Rebbe was very thankful that his wife's life had been rescued when he learned more about what endocarditis is. And he said, Dr. Weiss, what about the reunion? I said, well, I'm so thankful that I skipped the reunion to be able to help the Rebbetzin. He said, but what about the reunion? I said, well, I'm going to see they have a reunion every 10 years. So I'm hoping with God's help, my strength will be good enough in the 30th reunion. And maybe if I've even strong enough strength, I'll make to the 40th or 50th, who knows what. The Rebbe said, that's not good enough. So he asked me, is there any way you can find out about what you missed? I said, well, when you miss it, you miss it. He said, is there any way you can find out? And I said, well, everyone writes a little page about themselves. And of the class of 550 kids, about 300 participate. 200 are not that participatory, but I'll figure we'll each get a little booklet of 300 pages of what's going on in each one's life. The Rebbe said, Dr. Weiss, is a favor to me and to the Rebbetzin. Could you read all 300 pages? I said, Rebbe, I'm happy to follow your request, but I don't hardly know half these kids, and the other half were my friends. He said, even the ones you didn't know or didn't like, why don't you read everyone's page? So dutifully, I did read all 300 pages, and I come upon a young lady who was a nice classmate, but I wasn't, a close friend of hers. And she has a husband who had recently got one of the early kidney transplants at University of Minnesota, which had pioneered kidney transplantation when his kidneys went into failure. And I suddenly dawned on me that we have right down the street. We live on a very short street here in Skokie, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. And on the street is a very nice couple my age. The husband is a doctor and his wife is afraid to go ahead with this. And I said, maybe I should put our neighbors down the street in contact with this young lady from my class and her husband. And maybe they could encourage each other of how to proceed. Well, it became an instant friendship. They were just made for each other. They became instant friends. My neighbor and his wife, she had the kidney transplant. She's one of the very oldest living kidney transplant recipients all these years. So it was a miraculous outcome, and it was miraculous, nice friendship. And it was all through the Rebbe's insistence that I read these 300 pages. Now, you might say, well, it's just coincidental. I don't think it's coincidental at all. I think the Rebbe really had special God-given instincts about things like this. And this was one remarkable outcome from that first violation of the Rebbe's request not to go to the reunion. And I can tell you that's one of many stories. We probably don't have enough time to tell the other 200 stories tonight, but I want to just give this as an example. One of our rabbis here in Chicago, who Rabbi Hertz probably knows, Rabbi Reuven Brand, is so taken by the story and got to know a little bit more about the family that was benefited by this unbelievable connection. So he's not a Lubavitcher, but he really became a lot closer with Lubavitch after hearing the story and seeing the actual outcome right in front of him. It's one of many, many stories. I'll just tell you another little story. As long as I'm boring you with this one, I'll bore you with one more. So when my wife and I were newly married in Boston, and we were married at the Lubavitch Yeshiva in Worcester, my wife's hometown, we had the habit of loving the nature of Boston, the beautiful colors at fall. And we love the White Mountains, which are in New Hampshire, 150 miles north of Boston. So our joy in taking these trips to the White Mountains was how beautiful they are as you come driving in. And the amazing thing is when you get out of the car, when you get to the mountains, it's even more amazing when you're right up against them and have to climb them and see how much more beautiful the nature is when you're right there on the ground seeing it. And I told my wife that this experience is so much unlike the experience I had when taking care of all the famous patients who come through Harvard Medical Center for their care. Sheiks in Arabia come there. Presidents of the United States come there. The teachers are themselves world-class cardiologists. And what my uniform experience with this experience of taking care of really famous people, and sometimes at their home, I wouldn't tell you who they were and where I went, but in all these experiences, without exception, the closer you got to that person who was so big in Time magazine or in the New York Times, the closer you got, the more you realize there are a lot of flaws in that person, just like the flaws that I have. They were as lowly as I am. They weren't as big as the press would have you to believe, or as they would want you to believe. And I said the exact opposite was the case with the Rebbe and Rebbitzin. The closer you got to them, the more amazing they were. Just as an example, the Rebbe was not only a great Rebbe and a great thinker and a great kind person who really was concerned about his congregation of Jews worldwide, but he was trained in particle physics in the University of Berlin. This was no mean feat. Particle physics was brand new. Einstein had just developed it in the beginning of the 20th century, and the Rebbe was there in the early 1920s studying with Nobel laureates like Schrödinger, who, if you know the physics, Erwin Schrödinger was a very nice German man who fled Hitler too, but Schrödinger became a lifelong friend of the Rebbe. They had lifelong correspondence. You wouldn't know it because it's not in our books, but I can tell you it is definitely a fact. And he passed this knowledge on to his brother, who was in England, the Rebbe's brother. And I got to meet the Rebbe brother's daughter when the Rebbe had a bad stroke later in the course of his 15 years later. The Dalia Harari was the Rebbe's niece, and she loved the Rebbe, and she was also very devoted to her father, who was almost a self-taught mathematician through the works of his brother. And he lived in Liverpool, since you're all Brits out there and want to know where he lived. But what I really saw is the complete disparity between getting close to the Rebbe and getting close to other famous people. Just like being far from the White Mountains was one thing, getting close was even more grandeur. And it's really a very, very, very impressive thing. Even to this day, I just can't see anyone who I can get, a famous person I can get close to and say I have more respect for them than ever. It's usually the other way around. But this was not the case with the Rebbe. With the Rebbe, the closer you got, the more you realize his depth of anything, depth of feeling, depth of compassion. So I will tell you that all these things were amazing experiences. I wish I could share more of them with you. Some of them are a little bit more private or personal, but it was really an unbelievable privilege to be able to help the Rebbe and, in a sense, help extend his life to the last 15 years of his life, active life, where he really expanded the program of the Shluchim, and in doing so, put a foundation to all four corners of the world for Jewish people. And even though we would hate to have to rely on having to run here and run there, we are on much firmer footing as Jews with what the Rebbe did to spread the Bavitch and Jewish belief and practice to all four corners of the world more than any other Jewish person that I know. I want to thank you for giving me the privilege to share this with you. I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate Dr. Rabbi Hertz's effect on his community. He's such a wonderful leader, such a kind man. And there's never a day when I don't think of how kind he has been to me and how helpful. It's like his predecessor, Rabbi Schusterman, who was such a wonderful teacher. And he was the who preceded Rabbi Hertz at Congregation B'nai Reuven in Chicago. And I want to thank Rabbi Hertz for giving me this invitation to be with you and celebrate Rosh Chodesh Kislev. I wish everyone a Rosh Chodesh Kislev with the transformation of this world by our Rebbe in a way I can't properly describe. I'm not a good public presenter, so I can't give you it as if I were a showman telling you all the stories. But truly, the experience of being the Rebbe's doctor and a very dear friend of Rebbetzin Schneerson was a great privilege God gave me. Thank you again, and happy Rosh Chodesh.